The story of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow begins not with gunfire, notoriety, or fast cars, but with two children born into poverty-stricken Texas households in the early 20th century. Their lives, before colliding in a whirlwind of crime, were shaped by hardship, fractured family structures, and the hunger for something greater than what life seemed willing to offer them. Clyde Chestnut Barrow was born on March 24, 1909, near Ellis County, Texas. His parents, Henry and Cumie Barrow, were poor tenant farmers who scraped together a living from the land. The Barrow family had little stability, moving often and eventually settling in West Dallas, a rough, working-class neighborhood known for its poverty, saloons, and gambling dens. Clyde was the fifth of 7 children, and from an early age, he became familiar with struggle. The Barrows lived in a wagon before finally managing to afford a small shack. Clyde grew up knowing what it meant to go to bed hungry, what it meant to live without comfort, and what it meant to feel invisible in a world that rewarded wealth and connections. Despite his hardships, Clyde was not entirely different from other boys his age. He played music, teaching himself to strum the guitar and saxophone. Yet underneath his charm was a restless spirit, a boy who could not bear to stay trapped in poverty forever. By his teenage years, Clyde had already developed a taste for petty mischief, stealing turkeys, skipping school, and borrowing cars without permission. While some boys outgrew such antics, Clyde only escalated. He began stealing cars in earnest, committing burglaries, and owning the skills that would later define his life of crime. On the other side of Dallas, another life was taking shape. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was born on October 1st, 1910, in Rowena, Texas. Her father, Charles Parker, a bricklayer, died when Bonnie was just 4 years old. This left her mother, Emma, to raise 3 children on her own. They relocated to Cement City, an impoverished area of Dallas, where Emma took work as a seamstress to support the family. For young Bonnie, the absence of her father and the struggles of her mother instilled both a sense of responsibility and a yearning for escape. Unlike Clyde, Bonnie excelled in school. She was intelligent, artistic, and even wrote poetry, much of which survived to later tell her side of the story. Teachers remembered her as a bright girl who loved literature and drama. But while she showed promise academically, her family's circumstances never allowed her the luxury of chasing big dreams. She worked as a waitress to help make ends meet, and though small in stature, she carried herself with confidence. Bonnie was also a romantic. At just 16, she married her high school sweetheart, Roy Thornton. The marriage quickly soared. Thornton was abusive and spent much of his time in and out of jail. The couple separated, but never divorced, leaving Bonnie technically married until her death. This failed marriage planted the seed of disillusionment in Bonnie's heart, a sense that the stability of traditional life was never meant for her. As the Great Depression set in during the 1930s, both Clyde and Bonnie found themselves in worlds defined by economic despair. Jobs were scarce. Money was tighter than ever, and young people in poor neighborhoods faced limited options. The streets of Dallas were alive with speakeasies, bootleggers, and criminals trying to profit from the chaos. For Clyde, the Depression justified his escalating crimes. Stealing cars and robbing small shops was, to him, survival. For Bonnie, working as a waitress only reinforced her frustration. She served food to others while barely scraping by herself. Fate brought them together in January 1930. Accounts differ slightly about their first meeting, but the most widely accepted version places Bonnie at a friend's house in Dallas, where she was nursing a broken arm. Clyde, recently released from jail, walked into the room, and their eyes met. It was an encounter charged with immediate attraction. Clyde, charming yet dangerous, captivated Bonnie, who was drawn to his rebellious energy. Bonnie, petite but fiery, impressed Clyde with her wit and loyalty. From that moment on, the two were inseparable. This meeting marked the merging of two restless souls. Bonnie saw in Clyde not just a lover, but a partner who could take her far away from the dull routines of waitressing and the shadow of poverty. Clyde saw in Bonnie a loyal companion who would never abandon him, even in the face of danger. Together, they began to imagine a life lived on their own terms, outside the reach of the law and outside the suffocating boundaries of society. Still, their journey into infamy did not happen overnight. At first, Bonnie was merely Clyde's devoted girlfriend, standing by his side as he dabbled deeper into crime. But soon, she became something far greater, his accomplice, his muse, and eventually, half of one of the most notorious outlaw duos in American history. The roots of rebellion for both Bonnie and Clyde were planted long before they met. Through childhood poverty, broken homes, and shattered dreams. But together, those roots grew into something far more destructive. As the world around them struggled with economic collapse, Bonnie and Clyde began to carve out their own violent rebellion, one robbery at a time. Their partnership would become a symbol of love and defiance, but also of tragedy. This was the beginning of a story that would capture headlines, fuel folklore, and end in a storm of bullets on a lonely Louisiana road. But for now, in 1930, it was just a girl and a boy, two dreamers on the margins of society, ready to run headlong into destiny. By 1930, the lives of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were tied together by an almost unbreakable bond. What began as infatuation quickly turned into partnership, though the world into which they were stepping was unforgiving. America was deep in the Great Depression, unemployment was rampant, and crime was increasingly seen by many young men as both an escape and a means of survival. For Clyde, petty theft had already become a way of life, but the years ahead would harden him in ways neither he nor Bonnie could have fully imagined. Clyde's first brushes with the law were almost trivial compared to what was coming. In late adolescence, he began stealing cars, sometimes keeping them, sometimes stripping them for parts. He knew his way around engines, and his sharp mind allowed him to learn quickly which cars were easiest to steal and sell. By 1926, he was arrested for failing to return a rental car on time. Though the incident did not carry heavy punishment, it marked the beginning of a criminal record that would follow him for the rest of his life. By the time he met Bonnie, Clyde was already running with small, time gangs that focused on burglaries and car theft. Together with his older brother, Buck Barrow, and other neighborhood friends, he dabbled in robberies. The Barrow boys were reckless, but in West Dallas, they were not unusual. Many young men in their neighborhood lived in a cycle of poverty and crime. What set Clyde apart was his ambition. He was not content with small hastes. He dreamed of becoming a notorious outlaw, one who could live outside the rules of society and strike back at the forces that had kept his family poor. Bonnie, for her part, was drawn deeper into Clyde's world almost without hesitation. When Clyde was arrested for car theft in early 1930, Bonnie smuggled a gun into the jail hidden in her clothing. With it, Clyde attempted an escape, but his freedom was short-lived. He was quickly recaptured, and the act only added to the seriousness of his charges. This moment revealed something about Bonnie's character. She was not simply a bystander in Clyde's story. She was already willing to risk everything, her safety, her freedom, and her reputation, to stand by him. Clyde's imprisonment at the notorious Eastham prison farm in Texas proved to be a turning point. Eastham was infamous for its brutal conditions. Prisoners were forced into hard labor, often picking cotton under the blazing Texas sun. Guards used whips and rifles to enforce order, and brutality was part of daily life. For Clyde, the experience was not just punishing, it was transformative. Inside Eastham, Clyde endured physical abuse, starvation, and humiliation. But what scarred him most deeply was the violence from other inmates. Desperate to protect himself, Clyde arranged for another prisoner to kill a fellow inmate who had assaulted him. It was the first time Clyde was directly connected to a murder. Though in the lawless confines of Eastham, such acts were not unusual. Still, the experience hardened him, stripping away whatever innocence remained. When he entered prison, he was a reckless young thief. When he left, he was a bitter man who had vowed never again to be taken alive. Bonnie visited Clyde during his imprisonment, bringing him comfort in the bleak environment. Their relationship only deepened through letters and secret promises. But Clyde's body and spirit were breaking under the weight of the brutal labor. In desperation, he took drastic action. To escape the grueling work detail, Clyde deliberately severed 2 of his toes with an axe. The injury excused him from the hardest labor, but it also left him with a permanent limp, a physical reminder of the extremes he was willing to endure to survive. Ironically, just days after this self-mutilation, Clyde was unexpectedly granted parole thanks to his mother's persistent petitions. He was released in February 1932, limping and embittered, but free at last. Life after prison could have been a turning point for redemption, but Clyde had no intention of walking a straight path. Eastham had taught him one crucial lesson: the system was merciless, and he would never again submit to it. "I'll never be caught alive," he declared to those who knew him. From that moment on, Clyde's life was destined to be lived in defiance of law and authority. Upon his release, Clyde reunited with Bonnie, and their bond grew even stronger. She had waited for him faithfully, even though she had opportunities to walk away and start anew. The two now shared not only love, but also a burning hatred for authority and a dream of living beyond society's reach. For Bonnie, the excitement of Clyde's rebellion offered an escape from the dull, predictable life she had known. For Clyde, Bonnie's loyalty gave him confidence that he could take on the world and not stand alone. Soon after his release, Clyde fell back into crime, this time with sharper skills and a colder heart. He began robbing gas stations, small stores, and even committing bank robberies with a few trusted associates. Each haste grew bolder, and with Bonnie by his side, Clyde felt unstoppable. They were no longer just lovers, they were partners in crime. But with every robbery came greater risk. The police were beginning to take notice, and Clyde's name was already becoming known to law enforcement across Texas. Though the sums of money they stole were often modest, the violence that accompanied their crimes began to escalate. Clyde carried firearms and had no hesitation in using them if cornered. His reputation as a dangerous outlaw was slowly building. The time in prison had changed Clyde irrevocably. He was no longer a reckless youth testing boundaries. He was a man on a mission. The brutality he suffered fueled his determination to wage a personal war against the authorities, particularly the Texas prison system. His crimes were not only about money, they were also about revenge. By the end of 1932, Bonnie and Clyde were living as fugitives, constantly on the move, staying in cheap motels, and evading the law. They were still small-time criminals in the eyes of the world, but their trajectory was clear. Every robbery, every narrow escape, every night spent hiding on back roads brought them one step closer to becoming the most infamous outlaw couple in American history. The first crimes and Clyde's time in Eastham had shaped the path ahead. He was now a hardened criminal with nothing to lose, and Bonnie had chosen to walk that path beside him. Together, they were preparing to cross a line from which there would be no return. A line of bloodshed, daring heists, and a relentless chase that would captivate the nation. By the spring of 1932, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow had crossed a threshold from which there was no turning back. Clyde, hardened by the horrors of Eastham Prison, carried a new bitterness toward the law and a determination never to return behind bars. Bonnie, bound to him by love and loyalty, had abandoned her old life as a waitress and chosen to stand by his side as a partner in crime. Together, they were living on the edge of survival, robbing small stores, gas stations, and the occasional bank. Yet, as the months passed, their crimes became bolder, their circle of companions grew larger, and the world began to take notice. What had started as two young lovers on the run was now evolving into something far more dangerous, the Barrow Gang. Clyde knew he couldn't operate alone. While his skills with cars, weapons, and planning were sharp, he understood the need for backup, for men he could trust when bullets started flying. His older brother, Marvin, Buck Barrow, soon entered the picture. Buck had a criminal past of his own, but was attempting to straighten out his life. He had recently married Blanche Caldwell, a woman of strong will who hoped to keep him out of trouble. But Buck's loyalty to his brother was unshakable, and despite Blanche's protests, he found himself drawn back into Clyde's orbit. Alongside Buck, Clyde recruited young men from West Dallas and nearby areas, boys he knew from childhood, all shaped by the same poverty and restless ambition that had driven him. Among them was Raymond Hamilton, a hot-headed young thief who often clashed with Clyde, but proved useful in robberies. Another was W.D. Jones, barely 16 years old, who idolized Clyde and was eager to prove himself. With these companions, the Barrow Gang was born. Though loosely organized and prone to internal disputes, this collection of outlaws would soon terrorize the Southwest with a string of daring crimes. Their targets were not always glamorous. While Hollywood films later romanticized them as glamorous bank robbers, the truth was less grand. Clyde preferred small town grocery stores, filling stations, and mom and pop businesses. Places with quick cash and limited resistance. Banks were tempting, but also far riskier, with stronger security and swifter police response. Still, when opportunities arose, Clyde was not afraid to take on bigger targets. The gang's crime spree quickly attracted attention. Newspapers across Texas and neighboring states began reporting on robberies linked to the Barrow name. The press, hungry for sensational stories during the bleak years of the Depression, latched onto Bonnie and Clyde as headline material. The idea of a young, attractive woman riding shotgun with an outlaw lover was irresistible to journalists, and soon Bonnie's face was appearing in stories alongside Clyde's. Though her actual role in the crimes was often exaggerated, she rarely fired weapons. Her presence gave the Barrow Gang an identity unlike any other. Bonnie herself was both thrilled and uneasy with this growing attention. She relished being part of Clyde's world and embraced the adventure, but she also poured her inner thoughts into poetry, where she revealed glimpses of the fear, longing, and inevitability she felt. In verses like The Story of Bonnie and Clyde, written later but reflective of her mindset, she seemed to understand that their path would only end one way, in death. Yet for now, she remained committed, trading safety for devotion. The Barrow Gang's lifestyle was grueling. They rarely stayed in one place for long, often sleeping in stolen cars, abandoned farmhouses, or cheap roadside motels. They lived on stolen goods, handouts, and whatever money came from their latest heist. Constantly on the move, they learned to trust only each other, for betrayal was always a risk. Law enforcement across multiple states was on high alert, and roadblocks were becoming more common. Violence, once only a possibility, soon became inevitable. In April 1932, Clyde and his companions were cornered by police in Kaufman County, Texas. A gunfight erupted, and for the first time, Clyde took the life of a law officer. The killing marked a point of no return. He was no longer a petty thief or small-time outlaw. Now, he was a cop killer, and the law would pursue him with even greater determination. For Clyde, the act only reinforced his vow never to be taken alive. The gang's reputation grew darker as their crimes spread into Oklahoma, Missouri, and beyond. Banks were robbed, cars stolen, and bystanders occasionally caught in the crossfire. With every robbery, their names spread further across state lines, and the lawmen chasing them grew more desperate. Clyde's skill at driving kept them alive time and again. He could outmaneuver pursuers on winding back roads, pushing stolen Fords to their limits. Henry Ford himself once received a letter, allegedly from Clyde, praising his V8 engines for their speed and reliability. Whether authentic or embellished by legend, the story underscored how central fast cars were to their survival. Despite the danger, there were moments of levity and humanity within the gang. They posed for photographs, often playfully, with Bonnie brandishing cigars and pistols while Clyde smirked at the camera. These images, discovered by police after a raid, quickly made their way into newspapers. The photos transformed Bonnie and Clyde into cultural icons. Not just criminals, but folk anti-heroes in the eyes of some Americans struggling through the Depression. To the poor and desperate, they seemed like rebels striking back at a system that had failed them. To law enforcement, they were ruthless killers who had to be stopped at any cost. Not everyone in the gang was cut out for the outlaw life. Blanche Barrow, dragged unwillingly into the chaos by her husband Buck, often pleaded for him to leave Clyde and start fresh. She loathed the constant running, the danger and the criminal acts, but her devotion to Buck kept her tied to the group. Her presence added tension, as did the youthful recklessness of W.D. Jones and the volatile temper of Raymond Hamilton. Clyde struggled to keep order within his makeshift family of criminals, but his authority and Bonnie's loyalty held them together for the time being. By the end of 1932, the Barrow gang had become infamous across multiple states. They had robbed banks, stores, and gas stations, leaving a trail of violence in their wake. Their photographs had been splashed across newspapers, turning them into household names. And while some admired them as daring rebels, law enforcement saw them for what they were: dangerous fugitives who would kill without hesitation. The gang's rise marked the beginning of a bloody odyssey that would stretch across the American Midwest and South, leaving behind shattered lives, grieving families, and a legend that would outlive them all. With each passing month, their crimes grew bolder, their escapes narrower, and their fate more certain. The Barrow gang was no longer just a group of outlaws. It was a symbol of defiance, fear, and tragedy. And though Bonnie and Clyde had achieved the notoriety they once craved, it came at a cost that neither fully understood yet. The chase had only just begun, and the storm they had unleashed was growing darker with every passing day. By 1933, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow had crossed far beyond the point of return. What had once been small-time robberies of grocery stores and gas stations was now a trail of violent confrontations, daring escapes, and mounting bloodshed. The Barrow gang, once dismissed as a band of reckless youth, was now feared across Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, and beyond. Their crimes were no longer simply about money or survival. They had become a running battle with law enforcement, one that left a growing number of officers and bystanders dead. Clyde's transformation since Eastham Prison was now complete. He was not a petty thief anymore. He was a man at war with the system. Every robbery, every shootout, every mile driven in a stolen Ford V8 felt like a strike against the institutions that had ground him down. But with each act of defiance came blood, and the Barrow gang's reputation as cop killers grew darker by the day. One of the turning points came in April 1933, when Clyde, Bonnie, Buck, Blanchie, and young W.D. Jones rented an apartment over a garage in Joplin, Missouri. At first, it seemed like a temporary refuge, a place to rest after weeks on the run. But their behavior soon attracted attention. The gang drank heavily, fired weapons carelessly inside the apartment, and came and went at odd hours in expensive stolen cars. Neighbors grew suspicious, and before long, police officers were dispatched to investigate. On April 13, 1933, officers arrived at the Joplin hideout. What they expected to be a routine arrest turned into a gun battle that would make national headlines. Clyde and his companions opened fire with Browning automatic rifles, a weapon that outgunned the local police's revolvers and shotguns. In the chaos, 2 officers were killed, Detective Harry McGinnis and Constable Wes Harriman. The gang escaped in their Ford V8, leaving behind a bloody scene and a cache of personal belongings. Among those belongings were photographs, poems, and letters that revealed the personalities of the outlaws. The infamous pictures of Bonnie posing with a pistol in her hand and a cigar in her mouth spread across newspapers nationwide. For the first time, the American public saw the faces of Bonnie and Clyde, not as faceless criminals, but as a glamorous young couple thumbing their noses at the law. The photos shocked some, delighted others, and cemented their place in American folklore. But behind the sensational images was a darker truth. The Joplin shootout showed that Bonnie and Clyde were no longer content with running. They were willing to kill lawmen to secure their freedom. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states now viewed the gang as public enemies, dangerous fugitives who had to be brought down at any cost. In the months that followed, the violence escalated. Clyde's driving skills kept the gang alive through countless pursuits. He could maneuver stolen Fords through back roads at breakneck speeds, outpacing police vehicles that could not match the power of Ford's V8 engine. Yet each escape seemed to come with more bullets fired, more blood spilled, and more desperation. One of the most brutal episodes occurred in June 1933 near Wellington, Texas. Clyde was driving with Bonnie and W.D. Jones when he missed a construction sign and crashed the car into a ravine. The car burst into flames, and Bonnie was severely burned on her leg, suffering injuries that would plague her for the rest of her short life. The burns were so severe that she could barely walk, and Clyde often had to carry her. Despite her injuries, Bonnie refused to leave Clyde or abandon their life together. Her loyalty, tested by fire, remained unshaken. As the gang continued their spree, their crimes spread into multiple states bank robberies in Iowa and Missouri, car thefts in Oklahoma, and more robberies across Texas. Each act brought them deeper into a cycle of violence. Officers began dying with alarming frequency during confrontations. For the Barrow gang, killing lawmen became almost inevitable. It was kill or be killed, and Clyde's vow never to be taken alive was now guiding every decision. In July 1933, the gang found temporary refuge at the Red Crown Tourist Court in Platte City, Missouri. Once again, their suspicious behavior drew attention. Police, tipped off to their presence, attempted to surround the cottages where Bonnie, Clyde Buck, Blanchie, and W.D. were holed up. Another gun battle erupted. Clyde's automatic rifles tore through the night, and the gang managed to escape yet again, but not without cost. Buck Barrow was gravely wounded in the head, and Blanche was blinded in one eye from flying glass. The gang's victories were growing more costly, their escapes more desperate, and their ranks more fractured. The violence weighed differently on each member. Blanche longed to escape the life, pleading with Buck to abandon his brother. W.D. Jones, still barely more than a boy, was traumatized by the bloodshed and constant danger. Even Bonnie, though unwavering in her loyalty, revealed through her poetry that she knew their days were numbered. Yet Clyde pressed on relentless, driven by rage against the prison system and a belief that freedom was worth any price, even death. By late 1933, the Barrow gang was fractured and weakened. Buck died of his injuries after a final gun battle in Iowa, leaving Blanche captured and grieving. W.D. Jones eventually surrendered to authorities, his youthful bravado replaced by fear. But Clyde and Bonnie pressed forward alone, still robbing, still running, still fighting. The trail of blood they left behind made them infamous. To many in the Depression-era Midwest, they were villains who murdered officers and spread fear. But to some of the poor and disenfranchised, Bonnie and Clyde were almost folk heroes, symbols of rebellion against a system that seemed rigged against ordinary people. Their photographs, their daring escapes, and their defiance of authority made them legends even before their deaths. Still, behind the legend was the reality. Two young lovers, exhausted, hunted, and bound together by a promise to never be taken alive. Each crime brought them closer to the inevitable end. Each bullet fired at lawmen tightened the noose around them. And though they were still free, their freedom was measured in days and months, not years. By the dawn of 1934, Bonnie and Clyde were no longer merely fugitives. They were America's most wanted outlaws, hunted across state lines, pursued by sheriffs, rangers, and federal officers alike. The trail of blood they had carved through the heartland would soon lead them into the crosshairs of the men determined to end their reign once and for all. By early 1934, the story of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow was no longer just a regional crime saga. It had become a national obsession. For nearly 2 years, the pair and their gang had evaded capture, weaving in and out of state lines, robbing banks, stealing cars, and leaving a trail of dead officers and civilians behind them. Their photographs had been splashed across the front pages of newspapers, and their daring escapes had made them into legends. But the law was not content to let their myth grow unchecked. The killings of law enforcement officers, especially during the Joplin and Platte city shootouts, had turned Bonnie and Clyde into public enemies of the highest order. Now, the full machinery of law enforcement would be brought down upon them, and the hunt for the Barrow gang would become one of the most relentless manhunts in American history. The year began with violence. On January 16, 1934, the gang staged a daring raid on Eastham Prison Farm, the very place that had broken and hardened Clyde years earlier. Clyde had never forgotten the brutality he suffered within those walls. This raid was his revenge. Alongside his loyalists, he ambushed prison guards and freed several inmates, including Henry Methven, a man who would soon play a crucial role in their fate. During the escape, a prison guard named Major Joe Croson was killed. The raid shocked Texas authorities. It was not just another robbery. This was a direct assault on the state's prison system, and it could not be tolerated. The boldness of the Eastham raid forced the hand of state officials. Texas Governor Miriam Ferguson, under intense public pressure, sanctioned extraordinary measures to bring Bonnie and Clyde down. At the center of this effort was a retired Texas Ranger named Frank Hamer. Hamer was no ordinary lawman. Tall, tough, and experienced, he had spent decades battling outlaws, bootleggers, and bandits across Texas. Known for his patience, cunning, and sharpshooting, Hamer was the very opposite of the impulsive, reckless gangsters he pursued. Though he had retired from the Rangers, he was brought back into service with one mission: to track Bonnie and Clyde across state lines and put an end to their spree once and for all. Hamer began by studying the couple's movements. He knew that Clyde had a pattern. He preferred rural back roads to city streets, favored Ford V8s for their speed, and often returned to familiar haunts in Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. Hamer also understood that Bonnie and Clyde had sympathizers, friends, and even relatives who sheltered them. His task was not just to chase, but to predict, to anticipate their moves before they made them. Meanwhile, Bonnie and Clyde, though wounded and weary, pressed on with their violent rebellion. Clyde's skill as a driver continued to keep them alive through dozens of close calls. But the gang was shrinking. Buck was dead, Blanche was in prison, and W.D. Jones had been captured. What remained was Clyde, Bonnie, and a shifting cast of temporary partners like Henry Methven. Yet their crimes continued. They robbed banks in small towns, ambushed law officers, and clung desperately to their freedom. For Bonnie, the life was increasingly painful. The burns she had suffered in the Wellington crash left her crippled, often unable to walk without Clyde's help. At times, he carried her in his arms from one hideout to another. Yet despite her injuries, she refused to leave his side. Their bond, already forged in hardship, now grew even stronger under the weight of suffering. The American public remained fascinated. Newspapers fed readers every detail of the outlaws' lives, painting Bonnie as the cigar-smoking gun mole and Clyde as the cold-eyed killer. The truth was more complicated. Bonnie rarely fired a weapon in actual confrontations, and Clyde's violence was often born from desperation rather than cruelty. But perception mattered more than reality. To the public, they were symbols of both danger and romance, lovers bound together against the world. Law enforcement, however, saw them as murderers who had to be stopped. The FBI, still in its early years under J. Edgar Hoover, was beginning to coordinate with state authorities, though at this time many of the crimes Bonnie and Clyde committed fell under state rather than federal jurisdiction. This meant that much of the burden fell on local sheriffs, highway patrols, and Texas lawmen like Hamer. Hamer's pursuit grew more intense as he pieced together their habits. He learned that Clyde often returned to West Dallas to see his family. Even under heavy risk, he discovered that the gang had established connections in Louisiana through Henry Methven's relatives. By understanding these patterns, Hamer began closing in. The tension between Bonnie and Clyde's legend and their reality continued to grow. On the one hand, they were adored by some of the poor and disenfranchised, who saw them as modern-day Robin Hoods, striking at banks and institutions that had ruined lives during the Depression. On the other hand, their killings of law officers horrified communities and guaranteed that law enforcement would never relent. In the spring of 1934, the violence escalated further. In Grapevine, Texas, on April 1, 1934, Clyde and Methven encountered two Texas Highway Patrolmen, E.B. Wheeler and H.D. Murphy. The officers were shot and killed, an act that outraged the public. Only weeks later, on April 6, another officer, Constable Cal Campbell, was killed in Oklahoma. These killings sealed their fate. Whatever sympathy the public may have once had for Bonnie and Clyde evaporated. Now, they were not folk heroes. They were cop killers, and the nation demanded justice. Frank Hamer and his posse, which included former rangers and law officers from Texas and Louisiana, tightened their net. Patiently, methodically, they shadowed the Barrow gang, waiting for the right moment. Hamer understood that a direct confrontation could be deadly for his men. Clyde's skill behind the wheel and his automatic weapons made him nearly impossible to stop once in motion. The only way to end the chase was through ambush, striking before the outlaws even knew they were cornered. As Bonnie and Clyde continued to flee across the back roads of Texas and Louisiana, the law was no longer chasing blindly. It was closing in with precision. The hunters had learned their prey, and the noose was beginning to tighten. The manhunt was now personal, relentless, and inevitable. Bonnie and Clyde's days of escape were running out, and though they could not yet see it, the end was fast approaching on a lonely Louisiana road. By the spring of 1934, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were living on borrowed time. For 2 years they had outrun sheriffs, ambushed police officers, and dodged roadblocks, leaving a trail of chaos from Texas to Missouri and into the deep South. But now the law had grown patient, strategic, and united. The reckless chases of 1932 and 1933 were replaced with methodical pursuit. At the center of this tightening noose was former Texas Ranger Frank Hamer, a man who understood that Bonnie and Clyde would never be caught by ordinary means. They were too fast, too ruthless, too desperate. To end their reign, Hamer knew he would need patience, precision, and betrayal. The betrayal came through one of their own, Henry Methvin. Clyde had freed Methvin during the daring Eastham prison raid in January 1934, and in return, Methvin joined the Barrow gang. At first, he proved useful. He could handle a gun, drive when needed, and share the burden of life on the run. But Methvin's loyalty was never as deep as Bonnie's or even Clyde's other companions. He was younger, more impressionable, and his family ties in Louisiana gave law enforcement an opening. Hamer, ever observant, studied Clyde's movements. He saw a pattern. Bonnie and Clyde often circled back to familiar places, especially to visit relatives. Family was one of Clyde's few weaknesses. He would risk everything to see his mother in West Dallas, and now, with Methvin in the gang, he began making trips into rural Louisiana to stay near the Methvin family home. Hamer knew this was his chance. The Texas lawman built a small, trusted posse of 6 men, including himself. Among them were Dallas County Sheriff's deputies Bob Alcorn and Ted Hinton, both familiar with the Barrows from West Dallas, Bienville Parish Sheriff Henderson Jordan and his deputy, Prentice Oakley. These men understood the risks. Facing Bonnie and Clyde meant facing automatic rifles, speed, and desperation. A direct firefight could leave them dead, as had happened to so many officers before. An ambush was the only way. Meanwhile, Bonnie and Clyde's lives were unraveling. Bonnie's burns from the 1933 car crash still plagued her, leaving her crippled at times, dependent on Clyde to carry her. Yet she refused to complain, masking her pain with loyalty and poetry. Clyde, increasingly weary, drove endless miles through back roads, searching for safety that never came. Their world had shrunk to stolen cars, hidden hideouts, and fleeting moments of calm between shootouts. Still, they pressed on. Clyde dreamed of freeing more prisoners from Eastham, still burning with hatred for the Texas penal system. Bonnie dreamed only of staying with Clyde until the end, whatever that end might be. In private, she wrote verses that revealed her awareness of their doomed fate. In one poem, she confessed, "Someday they'll go down together, and they'll bury them side by side." It was less a prediction than an acceptance of destiny. The killings in Grapevine and Oklahoma earlier that spring had hardened public opinion. Where once there had been fascination and even sympathy, Now there was only outrage. Law officers across the South swore to avenge their fallen comrades. For Clyde, every mile driven now carried not just risk but inevitability. Too many lawmen had died, and the country would not rest until he and Bonnie were gone. The opportunity for betrayal came through Ivan, Methvin, Henry's father. Whether out of fear, self-preservation, or pressure from law enforcement, Ivy struck a deal with Hamer's posse. In exchange for sparing his son from the electric chair, Ivy agreed to help set the trap. He knew that Bonnie and Clyde often used the rural roads near his home in Bienville Parish, Louisiana. If the outlaws could be lured to that area, the posse would have their chance. The plan was simple but deadly. Ivy's truck would be disabled and left on the side of a secluded road that Clyde was known to use. The posse would hide in the brush, armed with automatic rifles and shotguns. If Clyde stopped to help, or even slowed down, the officers would unleash a storm of gunfire before the fugitives had a chance to react. There would be no warnings, no negotiations, no chance of surrender. As the plan took shape, Bonnie and Clyde carried on, unaware that one of their companions' families had betrayed them. They continued to steal cars, travel at night, and rely on Methvin's ties in Louisiana for shelter. To Clyde, the Methvins seemed like allies, people he could trust in a world where trust was scarce. He could not have known that this trust would prove fatal. In those final days, Bonnie and Clyde were more inseparable than ever. Photographs from the time show them smiling, posing playfully, but behind the smiles was exhaustion. They had been running for 2 years without rest. Friends were dead or in prison, and the net of law enforcement was tightening with every week. Bonnie's limp slowed them down, and Clyde's paranoia kept them from staying in one place. Yet despite all the danger, they still found moments of intimacy, sharing meals, writing poems, and dreaming of a future that could never be. Frank Hamer and his posse, meanwhile, grew more confident. They had studied their quarry, learned their habits, and now had the cooperation of the Methvins. All that remained was patience. Hamer knew Clyde's driving patterns. He knew the outlaws favored the back road between Gibbsland and Sales. Louisiana? It was only a matter of time before they came through again. In mid-May 1934, Bonnie and Clyde visited the Methvin farm. According to later accounts, Clyde promised Henry Methvin that he would return for him soon after a short separation. This detail was crucial, for it meant Clyde was expected to come back along the very road where the ambush was set. The trap was ready. On the evening of May 22, 1934, Ivy Methvin's truck was positioned on the roadside, its wheel deliberately removed to give the appearance of a breakdown. The officers, Hamer, Alcorn, Hinton, Jordan, Oakley, and Galt, took their places in the brush, rifles loaded, nerves taut. They waited through the night, mosquitoes buzzing, tension thick. They knew the outlaws would not surrender. Clyde had vowed never to go back to prison. Bonnie had pledged to stay with him until death. The posse was under no illusions. The moment the stolen Ford V8 came down that road, it would be war. As dawn broke on May 23, 1934, the stage was set. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were driving straight into destiny, unaware that their story was about to end in a storm of bullets. The dawn of May 23, 1934, broke quietly over the pine woods of Bienville Parish, Louisiana. The air was heavy with humidity, the back road between Gibbsland and Sales still cloaked in mist. To most, it was an ordinary morning. To the 6 lawmen hidden in the brush beside that narrow road, it was the culmination of months of pursuit. They knew that by day's end, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, the most notorious outlaws in America, would either be captured or killed. The posse was tense but prepared. Frank Hamer, the former Texas Ranger, stood at the center of the operation, his rifle steady and his patience unshakable. Alongside him were Dallas County deputies Bob Alcorn and Ted Hinton, Bienville Parish Sheriff Henderson Jordan, his deputy Prentice Oakley, and former Ranger Maney Galt. Each man was armed with powerful weapons, automatic rifles, shotguns, and pistols. They were not there to negotiate. They were there to end Bonnie and Clyde's reign of terror once and for all. Nearby, a truck belonging to Ivy Methvin sat on the side of the road, its wheel removed to simulate a breakdown. It was the bait that would draw Clyde in. Clyde had always been sympathetic to stranded travelers. He prided himself on helping those who seemed in trouble. More importantly, Ivy was Henry Methvin's father, and Clyde trusted him. That trust would prove fatal. The waiting was long. The men crouched in the underbrush, swatting at mosquitoes, straining their ears for the sound of an approaching engine. Hours passed. Then, just after 9 in the morning, the stillness broke. The faint growl of a powerful engine echoed down the road, growing louder, closer. It was the unmistakable roar of a Ford V8, Clyde's favorite car. Through the morning haze, the lawman spotted the vehicle, a tan 1934 Ford Four-Door Deluxe, stolen only days earlier. Behind the wheel was Clyde Barrow, his sharp eyes scanning the road ahead. Beside him sat Bonnie Parker, petite and fragile from her injuries, her face turned toward the window. The two lovers, who had spent more than 2 years running from the law, were now seconds from their fate. As the Ford approached the parked truck, Clyde slowed. Some accounts suggest he intended to stop and help Ivy Methvin, believing the man was in need. Others believe he recognized the ruse too late. Whatever the case, the moment the car reached the ambush point, the trap was sprung. Prentice Oakley fired the first shot. His rifle round struck Clyde square in the head, killing him instantly. The Ford lurched forward, rolling slowly, its driver already lifeless. The other officers opened fire in unison, unleashing a thunderstorm of bullets. Rifles cracked. Shotguns roared, pistols barked. The sound shattered the quiet morning as lead tore through metal, glass, and flesh. Inside the car, Bonnie screamed, a high, piercing cry that witnesses later said haunted them for the rest of their lives. She had no time to reach for a weapon, no time to escape. Bullets ripped through her body as the fusillade continued. In less than 20 seconds, the lawman had fired over 130 rounds, shredding the car and its occupants. Some bullets passed clean through both Bonnie and Clyde, embedding in the seats and doors behind them. The Ford rolled a short distance before coming to a halt in the ditch, riddled with holes, its windshield shattered, its doors torn open by gunfire. The silence that followed was deafening. The officers approached cautiously, weapons still raised, but there was no need. Clyde was slumped over the wheel, his head blown apart by the first shot. Bonnie's body was mangled, her legs folded unnaturally beneath her, her dress soaked in blood. The pair who had outwitted, outrun, and outgunned law enforcement for years were now lifeless. Their final ride ended in a storm of lead. Word of the ambush spread quickly. Locals rushed to the scene, eager to glimpse the infamous outlaws. Within minutes, the site was swarming with gawkers. Some cut locks of Bonnie's hair, tore pieces of her dress, or tried to take spent shell casings as souvenirs. The lawmen struggled to maintain order as the bodies remained slumped in the car, grim evidence of the violence that had just unfolded. By noon, the bullet-riddled Ford was towed into the town of Arcadia, Louisiana. Thousands gathered along the streets, cheering the officers who had finally brought the outlaws down. At the funeral home, the scene turned chaotic as curious crowds pressed against windows to see the bodies of Bonnie and Clyde. Their deaths, so violent and public, marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of their legend. For the officers, the mission was accomplished. Frank Hamer and his posse had delivered justice, though some would question whether justice had been delivered too brutally. There had been no attempt to arrest, no call for surrender. The ambush was an execution, pure and simple. But to the lawmen who had buried too many colleagues, it was the only way. They knew Clyde would never be taken alive, and Bonnie had vowed to die with him. As the nation absorbed the news, reactions were divided. Many celebrated the end of two killers who had terrorized communities and slain law officers. But others mourned the violent spectacle, seeing in Bonnie and Clyde not just criminals, but tragic figures swept up in desperation and love. The photographs of their bodies in the riddled Ford splashed across newspapers, shocked and fascinated readers. They were no longer just fugitives, they were legends. Bonnie and Clyde's final ride had lasted only a few seconds, but its echoes would last for decades. The couple who had once been two poor Texas kids, bound by love and driven by rebellion, met their end side by side, exactly as Bonnie had once written in her poetry. They had chosen a path of crime and violence, and it had led them inexorably to that lonely Louisiana road where love and defiance ended in gunfire. Their deaths marked not just the conclusion of a manhunt, but the end of a chapter in American outlaw history. The age of the romanticized highway bandit was closing, and in its place, a harsher reality was emerging. The modern lawman, armed, coordinated, and relentless, would always have the final word. The morning of May 23, 1934, ended with Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow lifeless in their riddled Ford V8. But in many ways, their story was just beginning. The bloody ambush in Bienville Parish, Louisiana, sent shockwaves across the nation. News traveled fast in the age of radio and newspapers, and within hours, the deaths of Bonnie and Clyde became the biggest story in America. The immediate aftermath was chaos. At the ambush site, hundreds of locals swarmed the bullet-ridden car, eager to see the infamous couple up close. Men, women, and even children pushed against each other for a glimpse. Souvenirs were snatched in the frenzy. Strands of Bonnie's hair were cut, her bloody dress torn for keepsakes, Clyde's trigger finger nearly severed as someone tried to take it as a morbid trophy. Lawmen struggled to maintain control as curiosity overwhelmed decorum. For many of those onlookers, the outlaws had been figures of myth, appearing in headlines but never in the flesh. Now here they were, broken, bloodied, and undeniably human. The Ford V8 itself, riddled with over 100 bullet holes, became an instant relic. Crowds gawked at the shattered windows and the blood-soaked seats. Its journey from crime scene to tow truck was followed by throngs of people, some weeping, others cheering. To some, Bonnie and Clyde were folk heroes who had defied authority during desperate times. To others, they were ruthless killers finally stopped by justice. Either way, their violent end ensured they would never be forgotten. The bodies were taken to Conger Funeral Home in Arcadia, Louisiana, where law enforcement attempted to restore some dignity to the remains. But the crowds outside were relentless. Thousands gathered, pressing their faces to the glass, desperate for one last look. Reporters snapped photographs, and within hours, the images of Bonnie's lifeless form and Clyde's mangled face were splashed across front pages nationwide. The photographs shocked America. Here was the reality of crime and rebellion, not glamorous, not romantic, but brutal and final. Back in Dallas, the families of Bonnie and Clyde were inundated with reporters, lawmen, and ordinary citizens. For Emma Parker, Bonnie's mother, the grief was immeasurable. She had pleaded with her daughter for years to leave Clyde, to come home and start over. Now, her worst fears had come true. For Cumie and Henry Barrow, Clyde's parents, there was a similar grief, tinged with a grim awareness that their son's life had been leading to this end for years. When Bonnie and Clyde's bodies were returned to Dallas, the spectacle only grew. Though the couple had often spoken of wanting to be buried side by side, their families refused. Bonnie's mother insisted her daughter would rest with the Parker family. Clyde's parents buried him at Western Heights Cemetery, where his brother Buck also lay. In death, as in life, society pulled them apart, though their legend would forever bind them together. Bonnie's funeral was held at McCamey Campbell Funeral Home, where an estimated 20,000 people crowded the streets to catch a glimpse of her casket. Some mourned sincerely, others simply came out of morbid curiosity. She was buried in Crown Hill Memorial Park in Dallas, her epitaph reading, "As the flowers are all made sweeter by the sunshine and the dew, so this old world is made brighter by the lives of folks like you." The Clyde's funeral drew similar crowds. Thousands filed past his coffin, some openly weeping, others glaring with disapproval. He was laid to rest with a stone that bore the words, "Gone but not forgotten." For his family, he was still a beloved son and brother, despite the crimes that had made him infamous. Public reaction across the country was divided. Many celebrated the deaths, praising Frank Hamer and the pause for ridding society of two dangerous criminals. Police officers who had lost colleagues to the Barrow gang felt justice had finally been served. Newspapers hailed the ambush as a victory for law enforcement, emphasizing the bravery of the 6 men who had faced down America's most notorious outlaws. Yet there was also a strange undercurrent of admiration for Bonnie and Clyde. The public had followed their exploits for years, reading sensationalized newspaper accounts and studying the playful photographs recovered from their hideouts. To many, they were symbols of defiance during the harsh years of the Great Depression. Two young lovers who thumbed their noses at authority, living free if only for a little while. Their poetry, their photographs, their refusal to surrender, all of it fed into a myth that painted them as tragic figures rather than cold-blooded killers. This duality, condemnation mixed with fascination, ensured that Bonnie and Clyde would not fade into obscurity. Songs were written about them, poems recited, and stories passed down in whispers. In rural communities, some continued to see them as Robin Hood-like figures, though in truth they had given little to anyone but themselves. In cities, people shook their heads at the waste of young lives while still clipping newspaper articles to save as keepsakes. The lawmen themselves were thrust into the spotlight. Frank Hamer, long respected as a relentless Texas Ranger, became a national figure. Yet he remained stoic, refusing to bask in glory. He knew what had been done at the ambush site was necessary, but it weighed heavily nonetheless. Ted Hinton and Bob Alcorn, who had known Bonnie and Clyde back in Dallas, struggled with their own conflicted emotions. They had killed people they once recognized as neighbors. For Henry Methvin, the gang member whose father had betrayed the couple, survival was temporary. Though spared the electric chair thanks to the deal with authorities, he would later die violently, struck by a train in what some believed was retribution or fate. The Methvin betrayal became one of the most infamous acts of the saga, a reminder that in the outlaw world, loyalty was rare and fleeting. In the months that followed, the Ford V8 was put on display, toured across the country as a macabre exhibit. People lined up to see the bullet-riddled car, still stained with blood, a grim reminder of the price Bonnie and Clyde had paid. The fascination with the car mirrored the fascination with the couple themselves, brutal, tragic, and unforgettable. By the end of 1934, the dust had settled, but the legend had only grown. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were gone, but in death, they had achieved something they could never quite grasp in life: immortality in the American imagination. Their story of love, crime, and tragedy was etched into history, destined to be retold, reshaped, and romanticized for generations. What remained was a nation both horrified and captivated, torn between condemning two ruthless criminals and admiring two doomed lovers. In that tension lay the heart of their legacy, a legacy born in poverty, fueled by rebellion, and sealed forever on a lonely Louisiana road. The ambush on May 23, 1934, ended Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow's lives, but it was only the beginning of their legend. In death, they became more famous than they had ever been alive. Newspapers, pulp magazines, musicians, and later filmmakers seized on their story, reshaping two impoverished Texas kids turned outlaws into cultural icons. Over time, reality blurred with myth, and Bonnie and Clyde became symbols of love, rebellion, and defiance, sometimes celebrated, sometimes condemned, but always remembered. Immediately after their deaths, the press went into a frenzy. Headlines screamed across the front pages of every major newspaper in America. Bonnie and Clyde shot dead by officers in Louisiana! Photographs of their bullet, riddled car, and lifeless bodies were printed and reprinted, shocking the public. For some readers, the sheer violence of the images confirmed that justice had been served. But for others, especially those weary of depression, era poverty, and disillusioned with authority, the images elevated Bonnie and Clyde into tragic martyrs. Journalists exaggerated or invented details to make their story more dramatic. Bonnie was painted as a cigar-smoking, machine-gun-wielding femme fatale, a ruthless killer who matched Clyde's violence at every turn. In reality, Bonnie was rarely the one pulling the trigger. She was more of an accomplice, a lookout, and Clyde's loyal partner. The cigar myth came from a single playful photograph found in one of their hideouts, showing Bonnie with a cigar in her mouth and a pistol in hand. The picture was meant as a joke, but newspapers splashed it across their pages, forever branding her as a deadly outlaw queen. Clyde, too, was romanticized. Some portrayed him as a modern-day Robin Hood, a rebel who robbed banks and gave back to the poor. But this was mostly fiction. Bonnie and Clyde rarely targeted banks. They robbed small stores, gas stations, and diners, often taking from working class people who could least afford the losses. They gave nothing away to the poor, instead using the money to fuel their endless flight. Still, the public's hunger for heroes during the Depression made the Robin Hood myth appealing, and it stuck. In the years following their deaths, ballads and folk songs about Bonnie and Clyde spread across America. Musicians composed verses that told of their daring escapes and doomed love. Some of these songs portrayed them as villains, others painted them as misunderstood lovers fighting against a corrupt system. Bonnie herself had written poems about their life on the run. Works like The Story of Bonnie and Clyde, and these verses only added fuel to the romanticized image of the couple. Her words revealed her awareness of their fate. Lines like, "Someday they'll go down together," giving the story an almost Shakespearean inevitability. As decades passed, their legend only grew. By the 1950s and 1960s, America was changing, and Bonnie and Clyde's story resonated with new generations. The counterculture movement, skeptical of authority and drawn to tales of rebellion, embraced them as symbols of freedom and defiance. The most significant cultural moment came in 1967 when Arthur Penn's film Bonnie and Clyde premiered. Starring Warren Beatty as Clyde and Faye Dunaway as Bonnie, the film transformed the pair into glamorous anti-heroes. The movie was a sensation. Its stylish depiction of the outlaws, its emphasis on their passionate love, and its shocking, bloody finale captured the imagination of audiences worldwide. Though criticized by some for glorifying criminals, the film became a classic, influencing generations of filmmakers and cementing Bonnie and Clyde as pop culture icons. The line between history and Hollywood blurred, and for many, the cinematic Bonnie and Clyde became more real than the historical figures. Their influence reached beyond film. Musicians like Bob Dylan referenced them in songs, and bands across genres drew inspiration from their rebellious image. Fashion designers borrowed from Bonnie's barrettes and skirts, Clyde's sharp suits and fedoras. The image of the stylish outlaw couple became a lasting aesthetic in popular culture. Even today, the phrase, "like Bonnie and Clyde," is shorthand for passionate, reckless love. Yet the myths often obscured the harsher truths. Beneath the glamour were real people, lawmen killed in ambushes, innocent victims caught in robberies, families devastated by crime. Bonnie and Clyde's actual lives were not glamorous. They lived in stolen cars, constantly on the move, eating cheap meals, often sick or injured. Their existence was one of exhaustion and paranoia, far from the romantic images in songs and films. Still, myths often outlive facts, and in the case of Bonnie and Clyde, the myths became immortal. Historians and criminologists have worked to separate fact from fiction. They remind us that Clyde Barrow was hardened in prison, embittered by abuse, and determined never to return. Bonnie Parker was a young woman trapped by circumstance, swept up in a love that offered excitement but guaranteed destruction. Together, they became outlaws not because of destiny, but because of choices. Choices that left 13 people dead and countless others scarred. Even so, their story continues to fascinate. Tourists visit their graves in Dallas. Museums display artifacts from their lives, including Clyde's guns, Bonnie's poems, and that infamous Ford V8, still riddled with bullet holes, preserved as a grim relic of history. Every generation finds something in Bonnie and Clyde's tale. Whether it is the thrill of rebellion, the tragedy of doomed love, or the cautionary lesson of wasted youth, what makes their legend so enduring is not just the crimes they committed, but the way their story touches universal themes. They were lovers bound by passion, willing to die together rather than be torn apart. They were rebels against a society that offered them little hope. They were flawed, violent, and reckless, yet undeniably human. Their tale echoes ancient stories of star-crossed lovers, only set against the backdrop of Depression-era America, with machine guns and fast cars instead of swords and castles. In the end, Bonnie and Clyde became more than just criminals. They became archetypes, symbols of love and defiance, tragedy and myth. Their story, retold in countless forms, reveals as much about the times in which it is told as it does about the outlaws themselves. The real Bonnie and Clyde died on a Louisiana road in 1934, but the legends of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow live on, immortalized in song, story, and screen. The saga of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow ended in a storm of bullets on a rural Louisiana road in May 1934, but the echoes of their lives continue to reverberate through history. Long after their deaths, their names remain inseparable. Their story retold in ballads, films, and history books. They are remembered not only as criminals but also as cultural icons, symbols of love, rebellion, and the darker temptations of the human spirit. To understand their legacy, one must look beyond the myths and examine the lessons left behind by two young lovers who defied the law and met a violent end. At its heart, the story of Bonnie and Clyde is about poverty and desperation. Both were born into working-class families in Texas, where hardship was a daily reality. The Great Depression magnified their struggles, leaving them with little hope of upward mobility. Clyde's early brushes with crime were not born solely of greed, but of a desire to escape the crushing weight of poverty and powerlessness. Bonnie, swept up in love and yearning for adventure, followed him willingly. Their choices, however reckless, were shaped by the economic despair of their time. Their story is a stark reminder of how hardship can drive individuals to seek freedom in dangerous and destructive ways. It is also a story of love and loyalty. Bonnie and Clyde's devotion to one another is undeniable. In letters, poems, and eyewitness accounts, Bonnie emerges as fiercely committed to Clyde, willing to endure pain, injury, and constant danger rather than abandon him. Clyde, for his part, trusted Bonnie completely, leaning on her both emotionally and physically, especially in the final years when her burns left her crippled. Their bond, though toxic in its consequences, was unbreakable. It is this aspect of their story, the image of two lovers united against the world, that continues to captivate audiences. They remind us that love, even when misguided, can be as powerful and consuming as any force on earth. But alongside love and desperation lies the undeniable truth of violence and crime. For all the myths of Robin Hood generosity and glamorous getaways, the reality is far darker. Bonnie and Clyde were responsible for the deaths of at least 13 people, many of them law enforcement officers. They left behind widows, fatherless children, and grieving families. Their robberies often targeted small businesses, hurting ordinary people who were already struggling during the Depression. The mythology of rebellion cannot erase the bloodshed they caused. Their story forces us to confront the consequences of romanticizing violence, reminding us that the line between fascination and reality can be dangerously thin. The law's pursuit of Bonnie and Clyde also offers a lesson in justice and authority. Frank Hamer and his posse, through patience and strategy, demonstrated the evolution of modern policing. The ambush in Louisiana was controversial. Critics argued it was an execution without trial, but it also reflected the reality of the time. Clyde had vowed never to be taken alive, and Bonnie had chosen to follow him into death. After years of running gun battles, shootouts, and casualties, law enforcement saw no other choice. The ambush underscores the complexities of justice, where moral clarity is often clouded by necessity and survival. Over time, their story has become a lens through which each generation projects its own values. In the 1930s, they were villains to some, folk heroes to others. In the 1960s, they were embraced by the counterculture as symbols of rebellion against authority. Today, they are studied as cautionary figures, their lives examined for what they reveal about love, desperation, and the glamorization of crime. Each retelling reshapes their legacy, proving the enduring power of their narrative. The fascination with Bonnie and Clyde also speaks to something deeply human, our attraction to the outlaw archetype. Across cultures and history, stories of rebels, whether Robin Hood, Jesse James, or Billy the Kid, hold enduring appeal. Outlaws embody the fantasy of freedom, of rejecting societal rules, of living on one's own terms. Bonnie and Clyde, with their youth, style, and passion, fit this archetype perfectly. They became the Depression-era embodiment of rebellion. Even as their real lives were far from glamorous, their legend endures because it resonates with our desire to break free, even when we know such freedom comes at a terrible cost. There are also lessons in humanity and fragility. Beneath the myths, Bonnie and Clyde were not superhuman figures but deeply flawed young people. Clyde was a boy hardened by prison abuse, his humanity scarred by brutality. Bonnie was a romantic dreamer trapped by poor choices and loyalty to a man she loved. They were not born killers. They were shaped by circumstance, environment, and decisions that led them down a path from which there was no return. Their story warns us of how quickly youthful rebellion can slide into destruction when unchecked by conscience or opportunity. In the end, Bonnie and Clyde's legacy is a blend of truth and myth, tragedy and romance, warning and allure. They are remembered not just for what they did, but for what they represent, the intoxicating mix of love, danger, and defiance. Their story continues to be retold because it touches on universal themes: the struggle against poverty, the pull of forbidden love, the temptation of power, and the inevitability of fate. Their graves, separated by the wishes of their families, stand today as quiet reminders of lives cut short. Visitors leave flowers, coins, and tokens drawn by the legend that outlived the flesh. And though Bonnie and Clyde were denied burial side by side, their names are forever linked in memory, history, and culture. As Bonnie once wrote in her poem, they did go down together, and in doing so, they ensured they would never be forgotten. The lessons of Bonnie and Clyde are as complex as the people themselves. They remind us of the dangers of glamorizing violence, the destructive power of poor choices, and the way love can both inspire and consume. But they also remind us of the resilience of human stories, how two young people from Texas, born into poverty and obscurity, could rise to a kind of immortality through their choices, their defiance, and their downfall. In the final reckoning, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were not heroes. They were not saints. They were outlaws whose lives were marked by crime and bloodshed. Yet in their passion, in their defiance, and in their tragic end, they became something larger, symbols of the eternal human struggle between freedom and consequence, love and destruction, myth and reality. Their legend endures because it is more than history. It is a mirror. In Bonnie and Clyde, we see not just two doomed lovers, but pieces of ourselves, the desire to escape, the pull of devotion, the allure of danger, and the reminder that every choice has a price.